I never thought the day would come when the very people who thought they were in charge of my neighborhood would try to intimidate me with fake officers. But when you live under the rule of an HOA led by a woman like Karen, nothing is ever off the table, and you'd be shocked at the lengths some people will go to prove they're more powerful than you. But what they didn't know, what made this entire encounter blow up in their faces, was that I wasn't just any homeowner living quietly behind a picket fence. I was the actual chief of police for the city, and when the HOA tried to pull their stunt, they froze the moment they realized who they were messing with. Before I dive into the whole story, let me tell you this. If you enjoy real HOA drama, unbelievable twists, and seeing entitled people get exactly what they deserve, then make sure you stick around to the end of this story, and don't forget to subscribe to Sham Stories so you never miss another jaw-dropping HOA showdown. Now, here's how everything unfolded. It started one hot Saturday morning when I was mowing the lawn. My neighborhood was the kind of pristine, overly controlled place where every blade of grass had to stand at attention or Karen. The HOA president would be at your door with a fine in her hand and a fake smile plastered on her face. I'd already had a handful of run-ins with her since moving in. It's mostly over small things she claimed were against HOA guidelines, like leaving my trash can out too long, planting flowers she didn't approve of, or having a flag that wasn't HOA sanctioned. To anyone else, these rules might seem ridiculous, but to Karen, they were her lifeline, her sense of control, and her way of proving she was more important than anyone else in the neighborhood. That morning, I had just shut off the mower when I noticed a pair of unfamiliar SUVs roll slowly through the neighborhood. They weren't marked, but they looked like vehicles used for security patrols, black with tinted windows. At first, I didn't think much of it. We occasionally had contractors or outside companies come through. But then I saw Karen standing at the end of the cul-de-sac, arms crossed, pointing toward my house with the kind of smug grin that immediately set off my instincts. Two men stepped out of one SUV, dressed in uniforms that looked almost official. They wore dark blue shirts with badges sewn on, black belts with equipment hanging from them, and carried radios that crackled like the real deal. If you didn't know better, you'd think they were local law enforcement. They carried themselves with the stiff confidence of men who thought their authority wouldn't be questioned. My training kicked in immediately. I studied their patches, completely fake, generic shields that said neighborhood security enforcement, and within seconds, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. Not cops, not deputies, not even licensed security guards. It's just hired muscle or volunteers playing dress-up at the request of Karen and her cronies on the HOA board. One of them marched toward my yard, barking, "Sir, we've had multiple complaints filed against you by your HOA for violating community standards. You need to come with us." The audacity almost made me laugh, but I stayed calm. I leaned on the mower and asked evenly, "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" The man flashed his fake badge like it was supposed to mean something. "Neighborhood Enforcement Unit," he said, puffing out his chest. "We've been authorized by the HOA to issue citations and make arrests for non-compliance." I looked past him to Karen, who was practically bouncing on her heels with glee, expecting me to fold under their intimidation tactic. Little did she know, I wasn't just some pushover homeowner. I'd been in law enforcement for 20 years. And the only thing that irritated me more than entitled HOA presidents was wannabe cops abusing authority they didn't have. "Arrests, huh?" I said, squinting at the man's badge. "That's interesting. Because last time I checked, impersonating an officer is a felony in this state." His smile faltered just slightly, but he tried to recover. "Or we're not. Impersonating, we're community officers." I held up a hand, stopping him. "You're walking onto private property, threatening to detain me, and claiming you have the authority to arrest me. That's impersonating law enforcement, and it's not only a crime, it's a very stupid crime to commit on my lawn." He shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting me to push back. A friend from down the street shouted, "Don't listen to him. He's just trying to intimidate you. Do your job and bring him to the board." I tilted my head, studying them, my mind already racing through the next steps. It would have been easy to pull out my badge right then and there, but I wanted to see just how far they were willing to go with their little charade. So instead I asked, "And what happens if I refuse to go with you?" The second man stepped forward, resting his hand on what looked like a holstered taser, though from the cheap plastic clip it was hanging on, I doubted it was even real. "Then we'll have to escalate, sir," he said sternly. My patience snapped at that point. I stepped forward, lowering my voice to the kind of sharp authority I'd used on actual criminals. "Listen carefully. I have 10 seconds to get off my property before you're in handcuffs for impersonating an officer. And trust me when I tell you, you do not want to test me on this." They froze, glancing at each other, clearly unsure of what to do. Karen shouted again, louder this time, "Don't back down. He thinks he's above the rules, but we run this neighborhood." That's when I pulled out my badge from my pocket, flipped it open, and let the sunlight catch the gold emblem that marked me as the chief of police. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the air, "I run this entire city, and what you two clowns are doing right now, it's a federal crime." You could have heard a pin drop. The two fake officers paled instantly, their bravado evaporating the second they realized who they were dealing with. Karen's face drained of color too, her jaw slacked as she finally understood the gravity of what she had orchestrated. For a moment, nobody moved. The men's radios crackled uselessly, and Karen's triumphant stance crumbled into a stiff, awkward shuffle. I took a step closer to them, still holding my badge up. "You're both under arrest for impersonating law enforcement. And Karen, we'll be having a very long conversation about your role in this," Karen stammered. "Wait, you can't arrest them. They're with the HOA." The absurdity of that statement nearly made me laugh again, but I kept my tone deadly serious. "Karen, the HOA doesn't outrank the law. You just crossed a line you can't come back from." That was the exact moment the entire neighborhood, who had been peeking out from windows and porches, realized this wasn't just another HOA spat. This was the day Karen's power play backfired spectacularly, and it was only the beginning of what would become one of the most chaotic and unforgettable battles in our community's history. The next morning started deceptively calm, sunlight spilling over the cul-de-sacs as kids rode bikes and sprinklers hissed across the perfectly trimmed lawns. But beneath that suburban peace, I knew there was a war brewing, and the HOA wasn't going to sit back after their little stunt failed so miserably. In fact, I expected retaliation. I went about my morning routine with deliberate calm, making coffee and flipping through the news, but my mind was laser-focused on strategy. Would Karen's next move be? And how could I turn it against her? As I thought about it, my phone buzzed with a message from Claire, the young mother I'd spoken with the day before. Her voice on the other end was shaky as she told me that two men in the same fake uniforms had been spotted walking around her street last night, shining flashlights into yards as though they were on patrol, which instantly set me off because that meant the HOA wasn't just trying to intimidate me, they were escalating their tactics on innocent families, hoping to scare the entire neighborhood into submission. I told Claire to stay calm, that I'd handle it, and after hanging up I pulled up the feeds from my network of cameras. Noticing that one of my motion-activated units had caught footage of those same men circling back toward Karen's house, just before midnight, confirming what I already knew, that they were working directly under her orders. My jaw clenched as I realized the depth of their arrogance, because impersonating officers wasn't just a misdemeanor, it was a felony, and Karen was digging herself a hole so deep that no slick HOA attorney could pull her out. I decided to quietly bring in a trusted ally from my department. Detective Harris. Someone I'd worked with for years and who I knew could be counted on to keep things under wraps until the timing was right. So I called him and laid out the situation. Careful not to reveal too many names yet, but making it clear that the HOA president was orchestrating criminal acts. Harris didn't hesitate. He told me to send over everything I had, and within the hour, I was delivering the video clips, the fake meeting notes, and the neighbor testimonies I'd compiled, watching as his eyes widened with each new piece of evidence. "This is bigger than a petty HOA squabble," he muttered, flipping through the documents. "This is organized harassment under color of law, and if we can tie Karen directly to it, she could be facing charges that'll strip her of everything." Hearing that only fueled my determination, but I reminded Harris that we had to move. Smart, because if Karen got wind that the police were onto her, she'd shred every record and coach her board members into silence. So the next step had to be building an airtight case while also letting her believe she was still in control. That afternoon, as if on cue, an official-looking letter was slipped into my mailbox with the HOA letterhead at the top, written in Karen's familiar sharp tone, accusing me of disorderly conduct and threatening HOA officers during the incident the other night. A laughable attempt at rewriting reality that made my blood boil, but also gave me exactly what I needed, proof that the HOA was doubling down on their false narrative and putting it in writing, which could later be used against them in court. I decided not to respond to the letter, instead filing it neatly into my growing evidence binder, because every move they made against me only added fuel to the fire I was about to unleash. Later that evening, I walked through the neighborhood again, this time less to gather stories and more to quietly reassure people that they weren't alone. And I could feel the shift in the air as word spread that I was standing up to Karen. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were starting to approach me cautiously, whispering their own experiences, ESO-authorized fees that disappeared into the board's pockets, fines issued without documentation, threats of foreclosure that were never legally backhand. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that this HOA had been operating like a mafia in miniature, using fear as their primary weapon. As darkness settled, I stood at my window once again, watching the street with a mixture of anticipation and dread. And sure enough, around midnight, the fake patrol car rolled past my house, its lights flickering just long enough to let me know. They were trying to send a message, but instead of intimidating me, it only confirmed what I already knew. They were escalating. And soon they'd make the mistake of pushing too far. I took a deep breath, already crafting the next stage of my plan if they thought they could outplay me with scare tactics. I was going to let them dig their own grave deeper, because every step they took was one step closer to their downfall. And when the time came, I'd be ready to tear the mask off their entire operation in front of the whole community. The air around the neighborhood felt heavier the next day, like the silence before a thunderstorm, and I could already sense that the HOA wasn't done with me. The so-called officers who tried to corner me yesterday were not an isolated act of intimidation. They were a test, a probing attack to see how far they could push before I retaliated. But what they didn't realize was that they had already crossed a line by impersonating law enforcement and stepping onto my property under false pretenses. I knew that their actions weren't just morally wrong, they were criminal, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I became, because if they were willing to try something like this with me, a trained police chief, then what might they have already done to intimidate the rest of the community, particularly the elderly homeowners or single parents who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back? I started my day by pulling out files, notes, and setting up my laptop at the kitchen table, transforming my home into a war room where every detail mattered. Because this wasn't just about protecting my pride, it was about protecting my community from a rogue HOA board that had gotten far too comfortable wielding fake power. My phone buzzed with texts from neighbors who had witnessed the altercation last night, some in shock and some offering quiet support. But all of them were too afraid to speak out against Karen, the HOA president, and her cronies, because they'd already been bullied with fines, threats of liens, or even verbal harassment when they tried to push back. I decided that fear had to end, and the best way to do it was by gathering undeniable evidence that the HOA was committing crimes under the guise of rules enforcement. So I started by reviewing the security camera footage from last night. What I saw only made my blood run hotter. The three men in cheap uniforms had tried to act authoritative, but the badges on their belts were poorly made replicas. Their patches didn't match any department, and the car they drove had a light bar bolted on sloppily with magnetic mounds, a classic wannabe cop setup. That was all the proof I needed to know that Karen had authorized or at least supported impersonation of police officers, which under state and federal law carried serious consequences. And I immediately uploaded the footage to an external drive, making copies to ensure nothing could be deleted or tampered with. But I also knew I couldn't go in guns blazing just yet, because timing was everything. And if I struck too soon, they might lawyer up, destroy evidence, or intimidate witnesses. before the truth could spread. So, I crafted my plan carefully. Step 1. Document every illegal act thoroughly. Step 2. Talk to the victims quietly to encourage them to share their stories. Step 3. Prepare an official report for the State Attorney General's office. And Step 4. Confront the HOA directly at the next board meeting to put them on notice that their game was up. As I worked, thought about how ironic it was that Karen and her allies always preached order and rules when it came to nitpicking about lawns, mailboxes, or trash bins, yet they were willing to break actual laws when it suited their agenda. A hypocrisy so bold it almost felt surreal. Later that afternoon, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, not just to clear my head, but to quietly check in with people who had been targeted by the HOA. At the corner house, Mr. Wilson, a retired veteran, told me in a low voice how Karen had threatened to fine him $500 because his American flag was slightly frayed at the edges, something that enraged me because flag display is protected under federal law and she had no authority to touch it. 2 blocks down, a young mother named Claire confided that she had received multiple letters threatening to take her to court over unauthorized toys in her front yard because her children had left a small plastic playhouse outside, and she admitted that she cried for nights fearing she'd lose her home. Story after story poured out of these visits, and what struck me the most was not just the cruelty, but the consistency. It was a pattern of control, abuse, and exploitation. That painted a clear picture of a power-hungry board led by Karen, who believed she was untouchable. That night, as I sat back down with my notes, I realized this wasn't going to be a small skirmish. It was going to be a full-blown war of truth versus manipulation, law versus tyranny. And I had to be smart about how I positioned myself because, even though I was the chief of police, I needed to let the law, not my badge, do the talking if I wanted justice to stick. The turning point came when I received an anonymous email from someone claiming to be a former HOA board member who had resigned out of disgust. Attached were scanned copies of meeting notes where Karen openly discussed sending a team to intimidate homeowners into compliance and laughed about how most people were too scared to ever report it. My hands shook as I read those documents because it was the smoking gun I needed. But it also revealed just how deep Karen's arrogance went. She thought she could orchestrate a fake police force and get away with it simply because she wore the title of HOA president, but she hadn't counted on going up against me. By the time midnight rolled around, my living room was covered in papers, files, and digital evidence. Every piece of it building toward the moment when I would drag the truth into the light. And as I looked out my window at the quiet suburban street, I felt the weight of responsibility settle over me, not just to stop Karen, but to prove to my neighbors that they didn't have to live in fear anymore. The days that followed were a whirlwind of investigations, interviews, and paperwork as Harris and his team began pulling every string of Karen's operation. What started as a local HOA dispute quickly snowballed into something far more sinister, because records uncovered in Karen's personal files revealed not only hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled from homeowners, but also connections to outside contractors who had been inflating invoices for landscaping, security systems, and even simple maintenance like trash removal, all under the guise of improving neighborhood standards. The fraud was staggering, and the more evidence we found, the clearer it became that Karen hadn't been working alone. She had built an entire web of corruption, convincing other HOA presidents in nearby communities to adopt her fake safety patrol idea, using the bogus officers to intimidate residents into silence. Sitting at the police station one evening, going through documents Harris had spread across the conference table, I realized the scam had gone regional, with nearly a dozen neighborhoods reporting similar harassment from supposed HOA enforcers. And though Karen had been the loudest and boldest figure, she was just one head of a hydra that needed to be cut off at the root. Harris leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, muttering that this was going to take months to unravel. But when he looked at me, there was determination in his eyes. He wasn't about to let this go, and neither was I, back in my neighborhood. The mood had shifted dramatically. The fear that once hung like a shadow was gone, replaced by cautious optimism as neighbors began meeting openly, sharing their stories without worry of retaliation, and for the first time in years, block gatherings became friendly rather than tense. Tom told me he hadn't felt that kind of relief since before Karen's reign, and though his voice carried gratitude, I could also hear the exhaustion of someone who had fought too long just to keep his dignity. One evening, as I patrolled quietly through the cul-de-sac, several neighbors approached me with questions about how to protect themselves if someone like Karen tried to come back, and I reassured them that real law enforcement had their backs. Now, not fakes, promising I would make sure no imposter uniforms ever stepped foot on our streets again. But even as I gave my word, I couldn't shake the nagging thought that Karen, despite being under watch, wasn't finished. People like her didn't accept defeat easily. They twisted, schemed, and lashed out when cornered. Mern Harris confirmed my suspicion when he told me she had already tried reaching out to one of her board members from the holding cell, attempting to pressure him into destroying records. That board member, shaken and afraid, came forward instead. Admitting Karen had threatened to ruin his family if he didn't comply, and that was the final push Harris needed to file for her immediate detention without bail. Watching Karen being escorted out of the neighborhood in handcuffs days later, shouting obscenities at me, was satisfying. But I knew it was just one chapter closing in a much bigger fight. With her gone, the HOA board scrambled to save face, holding emergency meetings where they pretended ignorance of her crimes. But the community wasn't fooled. Neighbors demanded accountability, their voices louder and stronger than ever before. And slowly, the old structure of fear and silence crumbled as homeowners organized petitions to dissolve the board entirely. Yet even as this victory unfolded, Harris warned me that Karen's allies in other neighborhoods were still out there, just trying to keep their grip on power, and that meant our fight wasn't confined to just one cul-de-sac anymore. One night, as I sat in my study reviewing reports, I got a call from a man in the next town over, his voice trembling as he explained that his HOA had just fined him thousands of dollars for having an unregistered vehicle in his driveway, even though it was his own car, perfectly legal and parked where it had always been. When he tried to argue, fake officers had shown up, demanding he comply. And he had stumbled across my name online through news reports about what happened in our neighborhood. He was desperate for help, terrified for his family, and in his words, I heard echoes of the same fear my neighbors had carried for so long. That call confirmed what I already knew: Karen may have fallen. But her playbook was still in use, and if we didn't act fast, other communities would suffer the same fate. The next morning, I met with Harris and proposed forming a task force dedicated to rooting out HOA corruption across the county, combining police resources with homeowner testimonies to dismantle the networks of intimidation. Harris agreed, though he warned it would put me directly in Karen's crosshairs if she ever found a way to manipulate from behind bars, but I didn't care. I had already seen the damage done, and I wasn't about to stand by while others were. Terrorized. Back in our neighborhood, Tom and a few others helped organize a community watch, not a fake patrol like Karen had concocted, but a genuine group of residents working with the police to keep the streets safe, and it was remarkable how quickly the neighborhood began to feel like home again. Kids played outside without parents looking over their shoulders. Neighbors exchanged waves instead of suspicious glares, and for the first time in years, laughter echoed across the lawns instead of silence. Yet even in these moments of peace, I stayed alert because I knew the storm hadn't fully passed. Late one evening, as I walked back from Tom's house, I noticed a black SUV idling just down the street, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. And when I approached, the vehicle pulled away slowly, disappearing around the corner. My instincts told me this wasn't random, it was a message. A reminder that the fight was still alivened, though I didn't mention it to the neighbors. I made a mental note to dig deeper. Harris confirmed later that several of Karen's associates hadn't been caught yet, and some had the resources to keep pushing back, maybe even to retaliate against those of us who had taken her down. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized the battle we started wasn't just about one HOA or one corrupt leader. It was about something bigger, a test of whether communities could stand up against the bullies who used rules and uniforms as weapons, and whether truth could shine through the lies. The night after I spotted the black SUV, I knew the fight wasn't over, and as the days passed, strange occurrences began creeping back into my routine, Letters with no return address slid under my door, warning me to mind my business. Phone calls where silence lingered on the other end before the line went dead. And even a neighbor spotting the same SUV parked down the road late at night with its lights off. It was clear that though Karen sat behind bars, her influence reached further than most people imagined. And Harris confirmed this when he called me to his office and laid out a file full of names contractors, HOA presidents, even supposed security officers who had all collaborated with Karen's network, spreading intimidation like wildfire across the county. This wasn't just corruption, he explained. It was organized crime hiding behind the mask of homeowners associations. And unless we finished what we started, more families would be subjected to threats, harassment, and financial ruin. That lit a fire inside me, stronger than ever before, because I had seen firsthand how fear could choke a neighborhood, how it turned friends into strangers and homes into prisons, and I wasn't willing to let that darkness seep into other communities. With Harris's backing, we launched the task force, gathering evidence from whistleblowers and terrified homeowners who finally found the courage to speak up. And each testimony painted a clearer picture of just how wide Karen's reach had grown. Some described being fined for flowers planted in the wrong color. Others for leaving their porch light on too late. But when they resisted, the fake officers appeared at their doors. Uniforms crisp and fake badges gleaming, demanding compliance under the threat of arrest. It made me sick to realize how many lives had been shattered by these lies, and the more I heard, the more determined I became to put an end to it once and for all. We conducted raids in neighboring towns, uncovering boxes of forged documents, counterfeit uniforms, and hidden accounts where hundreds of thousands of dollars had been funneled. And every operation brought us closer to dismantling the machine Karen had built. Back in my neighborhood, the residents began to see the difference tooth HOA. Stripped of its power, dissolved under the weight of petitions and lawsuits, and a new independent neighborhood committee rose in its place, made up of homeowners who wanted nothing more than fairness and peace. For the first time, the community breathed freely. Laughter and music returning to streets that had been silent for far too long. But even in this newfound peace, I kept my guard up. One evening, as I drove home, I spotted that black SUV again. This time parked boldly at the entrance of our cul-de-sac, and as I pulled closer, the driver rolled down the window. A man in his 50s, dressed in plain clothes, locked eyes with me, his stare cold and deliberate, and without a word he drove off. I knew then that Karen's allies were still out there, watching, waiting for their chance to reclaim control. But what they didn't realize was that the neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. We had found our voice, our unity, and no amount of threats could take that away now. Weeks later, Karen's trial finally began, and as I took the stand, recounting every detail of her intimidation, her fake officers, and her attempt to arrest me in my own home, I watched her glare at me with that same venom she had shown the night she tried to humiliate me. This time, she wasn't in control. The jury listened, evidence stacked high, and in the end, the verdict was unanimous guilty on all counts, with a sentence long enough to ensure she'd never see our streets again. Relief washed over the courtroom, neighbors hugging one another, tears falling as years of fear finally came to a close. But even as the gavel fell, I knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. Because corruption doesn't die with one leader, it festers, waits, and finds new faces to wear the mask. And that's why our fight had to continue. As chief of police, I swore not only to protect my own neighborhood, but every neighborhood that cried out for help against these shadowy tyrants. And I knew Harris, Tom, and every brave resident who stood by me felt the same resolve. That night, when I returned home and saw children playing freely in the street, parents laughing on porches and neighbors greeting each other without fear of reprisal, I felt something I hadn't felt in years' peace. But deep down, I also felt the weight of responsibility, because if Karen's network could grow once, it could grow again. And I would need to stay vigilant to ensure no fake badge or crooked HOA ever stole peace from my community again. And so, as the chapter of Karen's downfall closed, another opened a story of resilience, justice, and unity born from the courage of ordinary people who refused to be silenced. But let me tell you this, what happened in my neighborhood can happen anywhere, and the only thing that stops it is the bravery to stand up, to fight back, and to demand the truth, no matter how dangerous it feels. If you want to hear how this fight continues, how deep this rabbit hole of HOA corruption truly goes, and how far Karen's allies are willing to push back, then you don't want to miss what comes next, so make sure you subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because the story is far from over, and the next chapter will leave you questioning just how safe your own neighborhood really is. The silence after my words was deafening, broken only by the soft click of cameras and the low murmurs rippling through the neighbors who had gathered, because everyone in that moment realized the game had changed, and no matter how many times Karen tried to puff herself up with self-importance, there was no denying the power shift she had been publicly exposed in front of the very people she thrived on intimidating. But Karen wasn't the kind of person to back down easily. Instead of shrinking, she doubled down, storming toward me in her sharp heels, her voice shrill as she screamed about overstepping jurisdiction and meddling in HOA authority. Phrases that sounded ridiculous even to her own board members who stood frozen behind her. The fake officers, clearly rattled, shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes as if they suddenly realized the uniforms they wore were nothing more than costumes. Flimsy armor against real authority, and I could see fear creep into their expressions as I pulled out my phone and began dialing Harris on speaker so everyone could hear. The moment Harris's voice came through the line and I identified myself, explaining that the fake officers were attempting extortion right there at Tom's house, the imposters stiffened, panic flashing in their eyes, and Karen's composure cracked for the briefest second as she realized I wasn't bluffing. Harris immediately assured me that backup was on the way, his tone sharp with urgency, and I repeated that out loud for everyone to hear, letting the neighbors know that the real police would be arriving any minute. A murmur of approval swept through the crowd, emboldening Tom, who finally stepped onto his porch, straightening his back despite his bad knee, and he growled at Karen that she had no right to threaten him or anyone else on this street. That seemed to light a spark in others too, because one by one, homeowners began voicing their frustrations, shouting over Karen's protests, calling out bogus fines, harassing letters, threats, and the endless abuse of power she and her cronies had inflicted on them for years. It was like a dam breaking. The fear that had kept them silent was gone, replaced by anger and defiance, and Karen could do nothing but sputter, waving her arms frantically and ordering her fake officers to restore order, which was laughable, because none of them had the stomach to challenge an entire neighborhood rising against them. I stood firm in the center of it all, my badge glinting under the porch lights, a voice cutting through the chaos as I told the imposters they had two choices: stand down peacefully and face charges later, or resist and deal with consequences they couldn't imagine. That was when the first sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second, and Karen's face blanched as reality came crashing down around her. She tried to backpedal, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, claiming the men weren't fake officers but merely HOA safety volunteers. But the lie sounded pathetic compared to the evidence already mounting against her. When the first squad cars rolled up, red and blue lights painting the cul-de-sac in flashing color, the imposters froze like deer in headlights, some immediately raising their hands, while others fumbled nervously with their fake badges, and the neighbors cheered, their fear finally replaced with the relief of knowing the nightmare was ending. Harris himself stepped out of one of the cars, his eyes locking onto mine as he strode over, and without hesitation, he ordered the imposters to be placed in custody, their bogus uniforms stripped away as officers handcuffed them right in front of the neighborhood they had tried to control. Karen's voice cut through the air, shrieking about lawsuits and conspiracies, but Harris wasn't having it. He told her plainly that she was under investigation and that her words on record, combined with the footage I had gathered, were damning enough to warrant multiple charges. She tried to bolt, but two officers stepped in her path, holding her in place as the crowd erupted in cheers, some neighbors even clapping and shouting justice at last. I watched the scene with a grim satisfaction, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over, not yet, because people like Karen didn't just disappear quietly. They fought tooth and nail, dragging others down with them if they could, and until she was officially behind bars. I had to remain vigilant. Still, that night was a turning point, because the stranglehold the HOA had maintained was broken, and for the first time, the neighborhood felt united, their voices stronger together than Karen's threats could ever be. As Harris pulled me aside to go over next steps, he admitted the case was bigger than even he anticipated. It's involving financial fraud that extended beyond our subdivision into multiple other communities where Karen and her allies had set up similar schemes, funneling money into shell accounts through bogus fines and security services. It was corruption on a scale that made my blood boil, but it also meant we had the chance to do something even bigger than take Karen down. We could dismantle an entire network of HOA abuse that had ruined countless lives. Harris asked if I'd be willing to act as a liaison between the police and the neighborhood, since my role as chief carried credibility, and I agreed without hesitation, because protecting people from predators like Karen was what I had sworn to do. Later that night, long after the imposters had been driven away in squad cars, and Karen was left under tight watch while the investigation proceeded, I stood outside with Tom and several neighbors, the air crisp and calm in the aftermath, and Tom clapped me on the shoulder, thanking me not just for stepping in, but for giving the community back its courage. His words stuck with me, reminding me that sometimes leadership wasn't about authority, but about giving others the strength to stand for themselves. And as I looked down the row of homes now glowing softly under porch lights, I knew the fight was far from over, but at least now we were fighting together. The next day broke with a heavy tension hanging over the neighborhood, the kind you could almost taste in the air, because while everything looked normal on the surface, mothers pushing strollers, sprinklers ticking across manicured lawns, neighbors pretending to water flowers, the undercurrent of fear was undeniable. Karen thrived on it, but what she hadn't realized yet was that fear had started to transform into anger, and that shift was dangerous for her little empire. I woke up early, already anticipating her next move, and sure enough, by mid-morning, I received another so-called violation notice delivered right to my door. This time, accusing me of operating an unauthorized security detail because of the cameras I'd set up around my house, which was laughable since homeowners had every right to install security systems. But it was also telling because it showed how desperate Karen was getting to paint me as a threat. I filed the notice alongside the others in my binder, but before I could even finish my coffee, my phone buzzed with a call from Detective Harris, who had been digging deeper into the files I'd given him, and his voice carried a tone of restrained excitement as he told me that one of the so-called officers who had tried to confront me the other night had a record he was a former mall security guard who had been dismissed after multiple complaints of harassment. And more importantly, he was directly linked to one of the HOA board members through financial transactions. Harris explained that this wasn't just about Karen barking orders. She was paying these guys under the table, creating a fake police unit to patrol the neighborhood and intimidate homeowners. And that meant we were now dealing with fraud, impersonation, and possibly racketeering charges. I felt a grim satisfaction hearing that, but I also knew we had to be careful, because if Karen realized the police were circling, she'd cover her tracks fast. Later that day, I decided to pay a visit to the HOA clubhouse, the self-proclaimed headquarters of Karen's little empire, not to cause a scene but to observe, and when I walked inside, the sight nearly made me laugh out loud. 3 of the fake officers were sitting around a folding table in their knockoff uniforms, sipping coffee and pretending to review documents like they were in some kind of official station, while Karen stood at the head of the room, arms folded, giving orders with the smug authority of someone who thought she was untouchable. When her eyes locked on me, her face hardened, and she tried to dismiss me with a curt, "This is a private meeting." But I just smiled and reminded her that homeowners had every right to attend HOA gatherings. And the look on her face told me she hated being challenged in front of her followers. I sat quietly in the back, pretending to take notes. But really, I was recording everything on my phone, capturing her words as she instructed the board to step up enforcement and keep the neighborhood in line, which was incriminating enough but became even better when one of the board members asked how they'd handle complaints about the fake officers, and Karen snapped back, "They don't need to know they're fake, as long as they're scared." My pulse quickened as I realized I'd just captured the smoking gun, her directly admitting the fraud. I left without making a scene, slipping out while her goons eyed me with suspicion and went straight to meet Harris at his office, where I handed over the recording, watching his eyebrows shoot up as he replayed her words. "She's cooked," he muttered. "This is enough to start formal charges, but if we move too soon, she'll just play the victim card and spin it as harassment against the HOA. We need her to make one more big mistake." That night, as if the universe itself wanted to serve justice, Karen delivered exactly that mistake. Around 10 o'clock, I heard commotion outside my window, shouting lights, the sound of boots stomping across driveways, and, when I stepped outside, I saw the fake officers gathered at my neighbor Tom's house, pounding on his door and threatening to fine him on the spot for having his trash cans left out too long. Which was absurd because no HOA had the authority to levy cash fines on the doorstep. Tom, a retired veteran with a bad knee, looked terrified as he cracked open the door. But before he could say anything, one of the imposters shoved a piece of paper at him, demanding payment immediately. That was it. The line had been crossed, and I wasn't about to let them bully him. I strode over, my badge flashing under the porch light, and barked at them to stand down, my voice carrying the authority they could only dream of imitating. For a split second, their bravado faltered. But Karen herself appeared at the end of the driveway, her face twisted with fury as she shouted, "You're out of line, Chief. This is HOA's business." I turned toward her slowly, locking eyes with the woman who thought she owned the world, said clearly enough for everyone watching to hear, "No, Karen, this is criminal business. And you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The crowd of neighbors that had gathered gasped. Phones came out, cameras clicked, and I knew then and there that the facade had finally cracked. The HOA's reign of intimidation was collapsing in real time. And soon Karen would discover that she hadn't just picked the wrong neighbor to push around, she'd picked the chief of police.